Hello. Well, believe it or not, this is the fifth session of Art for the Isolated. And what I was going to propose as a project for this week was to be working with a garden theme and putting together a number of figures into a garden setting. So I don't know if you have a garden, if you've got access to a garden. It's beautiful weather at the moment, and it's going to be a beautiful weather this week. I've been taking photographs of the children out in the garden doing various activities. So I've got a number of photographs for you that I've sent out that you can work with, or you might have your own reference material. And I'm going to take you through a process of firstly drawing some of these figures from the photographs, having just a page of sketches, working fairly small, just to get a feel for the different poses. Do you like them? Can you make them work? And then a second stage would be to put some of those figures to work within some sort of garden setting. And I'll demonstrate that with a kind of collage technique, moving the figures around, finding a composition that you want to work with, and then starting a painting. And hopefully it will work for you to do this over the course of the week. Maybe at the end of this morning, Monday morning, that you look at this, we could have a little bit of look at some of your sketches and possibly your ideas for a composition. So I've started this is just an A4 sheet of sugar paper. I've started some figures. I'm just going to do a couple of examples to show you how you might go from a photograph to drawing a figure. So this figure of Inez with a watering can. I'll just start with a bit of an outline. There's a kind of curve to the pose. I tried to give you some poses where the figures were fairly sort of dynamic. So you'll see that I'm doing a bit of an outline. I'm not pressing very hard, and I don't want to get stuck anywhere yet. I want to get from this head up here down to this foot there. That foot is further back, so it's a bit higher. The big shapes of her dress are helpful, and then this arm is hanging down. So that's all a little bit loose because I'm still trying to gauge where things are. I don't press too hard, and that means then that I can change things. I don't even have to rub out. I can just ignore the lines that I don't like and replace them with something that I do like. And it may even be that I don't draw this figure precisely as it is in the photograph, but that I get quite a kind of dynamic, suitable, active figure in my drawing, and I think, well, that'll be great in a painting. So no matter that it's not exactly what is in the photograph has just got me started. So that's the approach to that figure there. I could go on, of course, look for dark. There's dark in her hair, dark across part of her clothes, and just filling that in. It's often good to have a shadow, so I can put a shadow on the floor there. And that could go on. I could strengthen that if I'm happy with it. And because I'm on some off-white paper, I could also look with my eyes half closed and hatch in a bit of light. There's particularly light on her neck and on her hair. She's wearing this white dress. So that also helps, I think, to get in a little bit of contrast like that. And when you put the white in, then you might think, well, actually, some of this dark should be stronger. So that was one way of beginning some of these drawings to get you some basic material. And again, as with some of the other exercises, I'm going to encourage you to do some drawings and then try and work from the drawings rather than working from the photographs, because the drawing process allows you to extract, edit something. So just one more quick demonstration. Here's a picture of a van with a rake, and this time, instead of using some lines, I'm going to use the side of the charcoal, and his pose is kind of like that. You know, that's the simplest I could do And then with the side of the charcoal, I could give him a dark head, an arm coming across, an arm going up, this leg coming out here a bit more, that foot in that direction, this foot straight on. So just getting some of the basics to do with angles, and probably the angle of the rake also matters. And you can see, you know, there's a start to a figure. I can smudge it. Notice that as with a lot of these poses actually, their heads are down. I thought it's good to give you ones where you're not necessarily getting much of a face, but where you have got some active, dynamic poses. So that, in a way, that's now starting to describe his clothes a little bit more. And actually, now that I look, I think that foot could be a bit lower. But again, it's willow charcoal. It's very easy to smudge it, alter it. And I could have also drawn with the eraser. You know, in certain places, negative spaces, negative shapes. Give them a bit of a shadow also, and one or two white bits. So just trying to show you a different way. Try the side of the charcoal and put down some shapes, maybe refine those shapes with an eraser. And there we go. There we got. So we've got some figures there that can be worked with. So from that, I'm going to then go on to the next stage of looking at a garden. This could be your garden if you're using my figures. You know, you could use your garden, or you could find some pictures of gardens. And we're going to put these figures into those settings and try and find a composition that's believable and attractive. So the next stage I want to show you is, having drawn the figures from the photographs, now put these figures to work via the drawings. So photographs have gone away for now. I have, on some brown sugar paper, I think it's useful that it's not white, but it doesn't really matter what colour it is, I've sketched out a bit of a setting, a garden setting. So we've got a shared green, we've got a wall with some fencing. There's a nice blossom bearing tree, another tree over here, and then a back wall with some bushes. So this is our garden with the flower bed along here. You might use your garden, and what are you looking for? I suppose a certain amount of space. So this is the bottom of the wall, so I have got all this area here that I can fit figures in to. It's a bit of a trial and error, this next stage, because we're going to try and fit some of these figures into this setting. And so I'm going to show you some ways which I hope are fairly easy to adjust, so that as you go through this trial and error, it's not a big deal to make changes. So the first thing I'm going to suggest, which may not meet with enthusiasm from everyone, but is this idea of tearing out the shape of some of the figures and using a little bit of collage. The advantage of that is that by tearing the figures out, so this is my standing figure with the rake, by tearing them out like this, you can actually move them around and see how well they work. So it's an example of something that's fairly flexible and can be adjusted and then refined. So this figure of Inez with the watering can, I've started to tear that out. As I say, it may not meet with universal delight, because I know some people aren't so keen on tearing. You can cut, but the point about tearing the figures out is it's an approximate way of working. It gives you some rough figures which you can refine. And in the example of this particular pose, it's that leaning over with the watering can, which is very characteristic. But I also want to observe some basic ideas about perspective. If I have the standing figure here, it's nearer, he's in the foreground, I want him to be bigger. So this figure of Inez with the watering can, I do actually want it to be a bit smaller. And again, I'm hoping that by tearing, you might find you can just be a little bit more relaxed about drawing. This is just trying to get the rough proportion of these figures and the basic shape that they make. So I think she's going to be a lot thinner. Something like that. I wish that was better, but let's put that there for now. So I'm thinking that she's going to be, leaning forward a bit more, smaller. She's in the background. He's bigger, he's in the foreground. I can think a bit about the spaces between them. Is it nice if they're nearer? Do they really need to be further apart? What's a good rhythm for these figures? I should probably try one more. So we've got this really crouching figure over here. Let's try that as one more. Maybe use the same paper. So I'll pause just while I tear that out. So I've drawn a few marks onto my torn shapes because they're not very convincing, these torn out shapes, but I'm trying to give you an approach that will allow you to move things around. You know, if you think about it, if you were to do a drawing by putting these figures straight onto the paper and then decide, oh, I wish I could move the first figure a little bit to the right, you'd have to rub it out, start all over again. So this is to hopefully, and I just hope this is convincing, to give you a bit of an insight into what kind of arrangement is going to work. So for example, if I put these three figures in a kind of equally spaced way, it's all right, but I think it's probably would be more interesting to bring this figure in a bit closer, possibly even have a slight overlap, to have a bit of a space between the edge here and that figure. To me, that makes a more natural arrangement. And this one here, this isn't a very convincing figure at all, but I'm just deciding whether it should be higher or lower. I often say to people, just keep the heads on the same level. The figures are going to get smaller as they're further away, but if you start with the heads on the same level, then you've got some way of keeping things reasonably sensible. You could possibly have the heads going slightly higher as the garden rises into the distance. So that's another way of doing it. But the smaller figures will be further away because their feet will be higher, if that makes sense. This figure's tricky because it's bending forward, so its head is going to be lower anyway. So I've got to play around with that a bit. But I think I want a kind of rhythm where these two figures are close to each other and there's a space and that one's further away. How many figures should you do? I suggest you do at least 2 figures, maybe try 3. If that's a reasonable point at which to settle on this as a composition, I could do a few of these. I think what I'm going to do, just to illustrate this to you a little bit more, how you could use the collage, is I'm going to stick these figures down now. So having stuck the figures down now, I can work into them and I can do some of the refining that I've been dying to do of the actual poses. But I can also start to do something with this garden to make this garden a bit more part of the composition. And as I work on the garden, you know, I can refine the edges of some of these collage pieces and make those figures fit into the setting, but also make sense of this composition. So you can see I've made quite radical changes to that figure because the tearing wasn't what I wanted. But I had a chance to move those figures around, and when I build up colour, actually this will come into its own. You know, for example, if I was to put some colour into the wall behind both these figures, I'm not only refining the figure, but I'm also starting to make those figures inhabit this garden space. And it's, you know, fairly simple thing to do. If we had a bit of, I can't remember, I think we're probably going to have sky up here, so I can work around that figure. Now this is just a bit of kind of provisional research drawing. So if you can enjoy that, you know, rather than it being a frustration because the figures aren't perfect, but you can actually start to get an idea of how this is going to turn into your garden composition, then I strongly recommend it to you. But it is, as I've been saying, a way of trying out. This is a trial and error process, but if you have a way of making quite quick adjustments so that you can move the figures, you can refine them later rather than refine them at the beginning and not get onto this stage of composing, then I think it is hopefully pretty useful to you. So I'm going to do a little bit more to that, not filming, and then the next stage will be to show you how you could use that to start a painting. Okay, so now I'm set up to paint. I wouldn't really expect you to be ready to do this, to paint this morning, Monday morning, but I'm just giving you some advice on what comes next, how this can progress. But I thought I'd just say a couple more things about the study that I did. So I worked on it a little bit longer. The big areas, I've been showing you how I've refined the figures by working with the negative shape in the background colours. But perhaps a thing to be aware of now and then is to stand back and see that hopefully the composition still works together. But it'll be often the big areas, in my case it's the grass or the fence or the sky, which will keep things together. It'll be by working with those negative shapes that you refine the figures, but also by covering those areas to connect the figures, you'll make the figures work better in the space. So I'm just going to do a quick start, much like what I showed you before when you were working with the figure in the interior. So I'm set up with, I've got an A3 board. If you're really unsure about this exercise, if it seems really challenging, then don't get too big. You know, try and stay at, that's actually not A3, that's A2, but maybe stay at A3. But as I demonstrated before, I would get you to start with some thin brown paint, and I'm looking at my study, I'm not looking at the photographs, and so I've got something of a fence, a wall here, and the lower part of the wall, something like that. It's thin brown paint, so I know I can rub all this out. Actually, that looks a bit higher, doesn't it? Maybe that's a bit higher up here. And I'm relying mainly on my sketch, and we've got our first figure here, down to here. Put his hands up there. It often helps to do just a few straight lines, just to get a bit of an idea, and also to try and get the relationship between them. So I shouldn't do much more to him until I've had a go at her. I put her slightly higher up. The curve. Going to be there. And then the stooping figure I fit it in over there. So you can see I'm not finishing anything. I'm trying to get a suggestion of each of them. And before I refine them, just got to live with the fact that they're not very good figures. But before I refine them, I want to be checking that they do work together in the way that I'd hoped, because I spent some time working on the kind of rhythm of one figure next to another. So maybe that should come over a bit. So that's something that you'll spend a little bit of time on, and if you keep your paint dilute, then you can smudge it and rub it out. Or as I'd shown you with the charcoal, if it's fairly thin and you change it, then the marks that you no longer want, just become superseded by what goes on top. So that might be the kind of arrangement I want. So I'll pause a second while I do a little bit more, and then I'll just block in some colour as a last stage. So I've done a little bit more to that drawn stage. I referred to my sketch, but I also referred to the sketch that I did originally from the photographs, because there's a little bit more in those. So once I've placed the figures, it's quite nice to be able to improve their drawing. So we're going to do one more thing, which is just to block in a little bit of colour. And as I've been stressing with all the other stages of this process, it's quite good to work with the big areas. So in my painting, that's going to be the lawn, the grass. I also put out a little bit of shadow in this drawn stage. So I'd make a darker green for the shadow. But as a first stage in blocking in, you just want to keep an eye on your drawing, and as you might have done a bit with the collage stage, block in some of the big areas in one main colour, or you might even, for example with my lawn, if I had a dark green ready as well, I could not only block in the negative shape of the grass, but I could also put in some of the shadows. But as I demonstrated, I think fairly well with the collage, it's good if this can be a fairly loose process. So don't make anything too definite. It's okay if you don't completely cover things. Give yourselves the scope to keep changing things as the painting evolves. If you fix things too much at this stage, well then it just becomes very uncomfortable when you want to adjust things. For example, this figure of Inez with the watering can, I actually went back to the drawing and brought her head much further forward, because I think that's what's quite nice about that pose, and that's something that even at this stage I can continue to refine. So again, the big shapes, this wall that's behind the figures is significant for defining them, the negative shape around them. So that's what I go for first. I don't go for small areas which may not make much difference, but some of the bigger colours. And I think for my scene it's the lawn, it's the grass, it's the wall behind them, and then probably even the sky. And it's always useful if, as you work with any particular subject, if you can notice fairly early on what's significant and what's less significant. Because if you then concentrate on the things that are significant, it makes sense that your painting will be stronger. You'll not worry about the things that aren't so important. And another big area I think in my painting is the sky. So we've got a garden and we've got trees, and there's all these questions about what do you do first. Where I've got some light showing through the trees, I think I'll probably make the trees a bit stronger before I put bits of sky in between. But in the end, it probably doesn't really matter. You're going to work on this over a few days, and certainly getting in the big shapes makes all the difference. So I've worked with the background, negative shapes around the figures, stressing that it's good to work with the big shapes to keep everything together. And then I'll do a bit to the figures, and I've just got one colour mix for them. When I do figures, I very often start with the hair. It can be quite helpful. And these poses, I hope that I've given you some interesting dynamic poses. And so it's quite good actually just to get the head established. And if these heads are angled, you might find actually in quite a few of the examples you're just looking at the top of the head, or you're seeing less face, a bit more head. And then I would go on blocking in other areas, not worrying about the gaps. If you don't fill the gaps in too soon, then you've got a lot more scope to make adjustments and adapt your composition as you see things, as you see them arise. So there we are. As I say, I don't expect you necessarily start painting by Monday 1 o'clock when we're going to meet and see how you're doing with your compositions. But let's aim for that there's something that you could show me and show everyone that is your composition idea with the figures placed in a garden, and we can go from there.